today's CHASM seminar. Thank you for joining us, Kavita. We're absolutely delighted to have you here to talk about this really, really fascinating topic, and one that, as I was saying just now, we're really keen to learn more about CHASM and potentially do sort of some more research in this space. So Kavita's here today to give a seminar entitled Debt, Mobility and the Pandemic, Migrants' Everyday Lived Experiences of Precarity in COVID UK. I'm sure a lot of you here probably do know Kavita and her work, but let me just give you a bit of an overview. She's Professor of Development Geography and Director of the Centre for the Study of Migration at Queen Mary University of London, and has actually also taken on Head of School recently. So extra special thanks for making time for this with those additional responsibilities. Her research spans migration studies and development and financial geography. Current projects for Kavita involve exploring practices of care, remittance sending, I should say, sorry, and digitalisation among UK migrant communities during the COVID-19 pandemic. She's also doing research on food insecurity, mobility and internal and international Zimbabwean migration, fascinating, and gender intersectionality and south-to-south migration. So that's an impressive array of research projects. Her books include Global Cities at Work, New Migration Divisions of Labour, and Migrants and Their Money, Surviving Financial Exclusion in London. And Kavita also has an edited collection coming out early next year on migration and sustainable development goals. So we'll look forward to that. Without further ado, I'm going to hand over to you, Kavita, if that's okay. So you want to start sharing your screen and kick us off.
And can you see that?
We can, perfect, thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Louise, for the introduction, and hi, everyone. Thank you for the invitation to speak as well. I follow the center's work with a great deal of interest. So what I'm going to do in the half hour, 40 minutes that I've got to speak is really to start with a brief overview of research on migration, debt, and crises. And then tell you a little bit about the project and the evidence base on which this paper or this presentation is based, and then really give you three cuts through our empirical or our primary data, looking at migration as a financial practice and particularly as a debt-financed practice, thinking about pandemic precarities and the interconnections with debt or the ramifications in relation to debt, and then looking at local and transnational caregiving that migrants engage in, or practices that migrants engage in, and how these also become intermeshed with debt over the course of the pandemic. So in relation to, I can't just change my slide. There we go. So just to begin with, Castle and Miller's argument that they put forward in the sort of early 1990s and have reiterated in subsequent publications, that we live in an age of migration, appeared to be turned on its head when the COVID-19 pandemic struck worldwide, such that by the late 2020s, commentators like Gamblin were positing that we now lived in an age of immobility. And this was certainly a sentiment that was shared by one of the people that we interviewed for this project, who said to us quite simply that then the pandemic started and everything stopped. Now, key and early concern as the pandemic hit major migration destinations was a decline in remittances, which international organizations like the World Bank predicted would be unprecedented and historic. So in its development briefs, the bank forecast a 20% decline in remittances in 2020 alone. And this was an obvious cause of concern at a time of escalating need. Now, in the months that followed, and perhaps really illustrating the significance of remittances as a source of development finance, national and global bodies stressed on the need to keep remittances moving. And that almost became, if you like, a global kind of mantra, that remittances had to be kept mobile. And this was reflected in the quite quick reclassification of remittance service provider businesses as essential services so that they could stay open during the pandemic. Now, the focus on migrants and on their labor, which generates these remittances, was perhaps less evident. And although there were some calls for the inclusion of migrants in protective public policies that were being enacted in destination countries or destination cities as well, what we also witnessed in quite quickly with the onset of the pandemic, and particularly the lockdowns, was how migrants and migrant bodies transition from being productive to diseased bodies quite quickly. And there was a palpable lack of welcome to outright hostility in host countries and host cities, where there was evidence that migrants were being incarcerated in hostels and very overcrowded hostels, but also that migrants were being met with a distinct lack of welcome when they were returning back home to their villages, to their cities. And the image at the bottom of the screen is of Indian migrants who work as daily wage laborers, who were decontaminated when they arrived in their host towns and villages. And at least part of this hostility of lack of welcome had to do with anxieties about unpaid and accumulating debts. So this kind of sense that migrants were returning empty-handed, that the remittance stream was being turned off, and what that meant in relation to the ability to pay back debt. Now, in sort of putting this presentation together, I thought it would be good to give a context of sort of the work that exists on migration, debt, and crisis. So, and as a starting point, perhaps to illustrate that we have very large bodies of work, obviously, on migration and also on debt, but that perhaps there is a missing link between this. And this might be due to the different emphasis of these two bodies of work. So that understandings of debt obviously revolve around a temporal relationship whereby creditors are tethered to their future and debtors to their past through an obligation that has been established. Migration is fundamentally understood as a spatial practice. So at its most basic, it's about the movement of people from one place to another. So whereas the emphasis of one is on time, the emphasis of the other is on space. And perhaps that leads to a little bit of a disconnect. So in a paper that Camille Asner and I wrote for Chris's special edition, actually, and I think Chris is in the audience, we elaborated upon this notion of migration debt ecologies that really built upon Chris's work on debt ecologies and sort of looked at it within the context of migration. And we argued that this allowed us to do three things. First of all, it allowed us to foreground migration as a financial practice, and particularly as a debt-financed practice. And this was quite significant. There is a small and growing body of work that looks at sort of the financial kind of, if you like, practices that underpin migration, but it's much more recent and much less voluminous in comparison to sort of other aspects of migration that receive a lot more attention. And I think if we look at migration as a financial practice, and particularly in relation to debt, we recognize the increased significance of intermediaries who provide both legal and illegal services to navigate increasingly complicated migration regimes. And what really this evidence is the destructive debt implications of contemporary migration policies. And this is something that is coming out in our South to South migration project that Louise was talking about a minute ago. The really growing role of these intermediaries, the extent to which migration is becoming a more and more expensive affair, and therefore needs debt, needs loans, needs borrowing at quite an extensive scale in order to facilitate it. We argue that the notion of migrant debt ecologies also allows you to interrogate debt from a migration lens, or from a mobility lens, if you like, so that it's important to recognize that debt shapes individual mobilities in terms of who moves and who doesn't move, in terms of how far people move, in terms of where they go to. So debt really does propel migration, if you like, in very specific ways. And then in drawing upon this idea of debt ecologies, our argument is that this allows or brings into purview really quite complex practices that traverse numerous boundaries. So it kind of decenters the predominant focus, which has been in debt, which is arguably something that we see in debt studies, which is on formal debts, which are enfolded within national spaces. If we look at migrant debt ecologies, we're actually traversing a lot of boundaries, which Ross Aitken also picks up in his work. And these boundaries are between the formal and the informal, between debt as a social relation, but also as a financial relation, between market and non-market. And also thinking about debt then as a financial, social, moral, and emotional relation. So thinking about it in all of its complexity, and not just about money, and not just about financial sort of linkages. And then sort of the third bit of the puzzle, if you like, is the focus on crisis and looking at or positing COVID-19 as a crisis. And I think here critical social science work, such as that done by Anna Lindley, particularly in relation to migration, is quite important in recognizing or in critiquing rather the notion of crises as unprecedented, in critiquing the notion of crisis or the bias of crisis of being very much about the present, and so not sort of thinking about the histories of crisis, etc. So this kind of work has been really, really critical in highlighting the longer histories and the diverse spatialities of crises, that crises don't come from nowhere, they actually have a longer history of it, and that they're not of the moment, but actually across time and across space. And I think that this is something that's quite evident in relation to COVID-19. What we're also beginning to see is that not only do we not have this sense of where COVID-19 came back and why it had such a differential impact on different places, and if we looked at a longer sort of historical perspective, that would become evident. You'll also see that in this kind of notion of crisis as of being off the moment and unprecedented, is that it's also looked at disconnected kinds of scales. So the writing that is appearing on debt and COVID-19 is very much at the national scale, and what's going to happen to nation states and how they're going to become more indebted. There's less of a focus on household debt, particularly when we're talking about migrant households. So that might be different in different places, but when we're looking at migrant households, it's not being interrogated at the level of the household debt and what a return or a loss of job, etc., might mean in terms of that. And I think also what it allows us to do is really give us an opportunity to think about how remittances connect to debt in times of crisis. So that connection is not really interrogated to the extent that you might think it is. Remittances are often understood. So if they are looked at, it's that remittances pay debt. And that's why migrants remit so much, because they're actually paying off debt. And that is certainly true. But it's also the context that we're beginning to see that remittances are used as collateral to raise debt. So microfinance debts that were sort of issued during the COVID-19 pandemic, which sustained lots of really poor households, were actually given out on the basis of remittance income. So remittances can serve as collateral for debt. And this is something that's coming out of research that's being done in Cambodia by Vincent Gurmo and his colleagues. So it's quite interesting to sort of start to unpack this relationship as well. So I wanted to move on to talk about, or to tell you a little bit about the project from which or on which this presentation is based. It's called Connecting During COVID, and it was funded by the Economic and Social Research Council as part of its rapid response to COVID-19. So the project itself has three key ambitions: is to map what we call crisis/resilient remittance trajectory. So to look at what happened remittances, so very much based within that context of remittances are going to decline very sharply, what's going to happen. So we've done that over the period of the project. To explore migrant well-being and practices of care within this context, so really thinking about remittances as practices of care or as part of a broader repertoire of practices of care, and what happens to migrant well-being when they are not able to remit, when so much of the positivity around migration is built around being remitters. If you're unable to remit, and particularly at a time of crisis, what actually happens to your sense of self and to your own well-being. And then, of course, also looking at the digitization of both remittance sending, so at financial relationships, but also social relations. So we're looking at new and old migrant communities, and we've included Somali, Indian, and Brazilian migrant communities living in London, Glasgow, and Cardiff. And the project team is quite large, and it's old friends and old colleagues who I've worked with on a series of projects. So Elaine Chase based at UCL, Laura Hammond at SOAS, Anna Lindley at SOAS, and then our research assistants, Gabriela Luariero, Saliha Majihad Hajad, and Kaltun Fadal, who've all been based at Queen Mary for the past 18 months. So just to tell you a bit about the methods, it's a mixed methods project in which we've done a quantitative online survey. We've actually done 2 surveys. So this is a slightly outdated slide. I didn't get the chance to update. So what is reported on the bottom right-hand corner is the first survey. And we've since done a second survey of 60 households. This was supplemented by semi-structured interviews that were linked to the survey. So people who participated in the survey who were also interested in doing interviews. We now have over 70 interviews. We've done community spotlight workshops. 2 of those have been held, focusing on different aspects of migration crisis and the pandemic and remittances, and also some focus group discussions. What I'm going to be focusing on in relation to the rest of the paper, and really sort of setting out, if you like, the empirical or taking you through some of our findings, is the Indian migrant community. And I'll tell you the reasons why in a minute, but just to highlight the fact that the Indian migrant community we engaged with were living in London and living in Glasgow. That this is a very diverse community, and it was one of the reasons why we chose to work with them, besides the fact that we have previous connections in all three of the communities that we worked with. But when I say this is a diverse community, it's important to recognize that the Indian migrant community is actually made up of what one of our participants told us: there's many Indias in India, or there are many Indians in Indians. And so this kind of sense that this is a community that encompasses both a diaspora, so a community that is into its second and third generation in the United Kingdom, but also a community that is comprised of quite new arrivals, so people who've been here for 2-3 years. It's a community that's diverse in terms of its settlement status or its immigration status, if you like, and there's a whole diversity of immigration status in terms of its work histories. So Indian migrants predominant in the highly skilled or the super skilled migration category, but Indian migrants are also found in undocumented, low income, low skilled, or what is classified as low skilled work. So very diverse in its economic kind of profile. And that was reflected in kind of the income profile of this community as well. I'm going to focus not just on the Indian community, but on a subset of this community as well, given its diversity, and really taking up the interviews and the surveys that we did with undocumented migrants and international students, for the reason that these were the two, if you like, subsets of this community who particularly focused on debt, or who repeatedly returned to narratives of debt or experiences of debt when talking us through various different aspects of what had happened to them during the pandemic. Just to draw your attention to the fact that while the international students came from all over India, there were some concentrations from sort of North India and a couple from Chennai. The undocumented migrants were all drawn from the state of Kerala. And I just wanted to draw attention to this because it becomes important just further along. These were migrants who not only were from Kerala, but who had, the majority of them had migrated to the Gulf states before they had come to London. So these were not first-time migrants. These were people who had had a considerable history of migration and had now moved to a new location. So the Gulf is a very important destination for migrants from Kerala. There are more daily flights, I'm told, from Kerala to the Gulf states than there are to the national capital of Delhi, which just shows you the frequency of kind of travel. Wider research notes that 20% of remittances that go to India are actually heading for Kerala. India was the top recipient in 2021, remittance recipient across the globe. If Kerala was a country, it's estimated that it would be the 5th largest remittance recipient economy in the world after Haiti, Tonga, and Somalia. So it's a really significant area of out migration. What we're also seeing, though, is very heavy indigenization policies being pursued in the Gulf states to try and reduce their dependency on migrant labor. And so it's estimated that Indian migration or Kerala migration to the Gulf states has declined from 8 to just over 6 million in the past 4 years. So these migrants are looking for new places to migrate to, and that's important to bear in mind. So taking you through just then some of the empirical findings, and starting off first by thinking about how migration is a financial practice, or what is the evidence of migration as a financial practice. And I've termed this as kind of debt-fueled, but also as debt-financed mobilities. And I think some of the things that you'll be able to pick up from the extracts that we have, or that I've included here, is or to try and highlight a couple of things. First of all, is the extent to which migration is the outcome of a whole series of sort of events coming together. So in the case of this particular migrant, it was having a large number of loans that he had borrowed in order to set up a business. The business was collapsing. The debtors were increasingly becoming aware that the business was collapsing, and they were demanding a return of the money that they had lent this migrant. He was himself going through a crisis. His sister had just been diagnosed with cancer. He had had an accident. They didn't have a proper house to stay in. So this kind of increasing sort of sense of deprivation, vulnerability, and crises. And then a phone call from a friend who's in London and says, why don't you come to the UK? A reflection on his part: will I be able to, what would the lifestyle be like? What will be the living conditions like? Will I get a proper job, etc.? But it's increasingly difficult to stay back in Kerala. I have no option. So I took that opportunity, and that's how I reached the United Kingdom in 2015. What we're beginning to see, or what we see through a lot of these narratives, is the significance of previous unsuccessful migrations. And that's quite important. In the context of Carolan migration, the work of anthropologists Osella and Osella is really instructive in how they sort of distinguish between successful and unsuccessful migrants, how that's tied up to masculinities and senses of well-being. But what we see is how migration is becoming a debt-fueled kind of, if you like, process. And so you partake in one migration. And for many of these migrants, they lived in the Gulf for a long period of time, separated from their families, trying to pay back the debt that had got them to the Gulf in the first place, and then to accumulate savings, which would make them successful migrants. But these monies that they accumulate through their migrations are spent quite quickly, some of it in kind of ostentatious kind of consumption to make yourself or to present yourself as a successful migrant. It's spent on dowries, it's spent on the purchase of gold, it's spent on the purchase of property. So some of it to acquire assets, but a lot of it also to sort of, if you like, to highlight your success as a migrant. With the indigenization that's going on of employment in the Gulf states, there is now a search for other places to go to. And these migrants tell us that they have agents who offer them different destinations, the UK, Canada, and Australia. And many of these places become or are preferable for these migrants, that even if they had the opportunity to go back to the Gulf, which many of them said they didn't, even if they did, they chose to come to the United Kingdom. Why? Because you have the potential to move with your family. So many of them are actually coming with a spouse, coming with dependent children, but also that there is the prospect of migrating permanently, which is never there with the Gulf. So it's about sort of a different type of migration. There's disinformation on the availability of jobs. There's disinformation on the ease of settlement. And it is a very costly affair that migrants told us quite routinely that they were spending between 15 to 20,000 pounds in order to migrate to the United Kingdom. So not surprisingly then that this migration is leading to an erosion of physical and financial assets. You're trying to raise loans, you're just paying the interest on the loan, as this migrant woman told us in this context, and then a pandemic hits, you lose your job and you're unable to pay back that loan. And that in itself creates a lot of stress for these migrants whose family members are now being harassed back home because of the loans that they've acquired. So parents who are being harassed for the repayment of loans. And something that we came across quite incidentally was this remittance agents company, Mahout, which is used very much by Carolan migrants, where you can actually see a really sort of explicit coming together of remittances and debt economy, so that you can, or not only can you send your remittances, but you can also pawn your gold. So a lot of your investment, or a lot of your savings are invested in gold. Your gold can be pawned to raise funds to migrate. Your gold can be pawned to raise funds to remit. And you have the same agency providing both services. But alongside an erosion of physical and financial assets, people are losing their property, or they're remortgaging property, they're remortgaging their gold. There's also an erosion, or a sense of an erosion of social assets. So the shame and the dishonor that comes from not being able to pay back. The shame and dishonor of putting your parents in a vulnerable situation, and how that vulnerability escalates during the time of during the pandemic time. What we found was that these were multiple, in terms of sort of thinking about how is the money raised, these are multiple loans from multiple places. It's like I said, it's about property being remortgaged, it's about gold, it's about loans from family, it's about loans from banks. So it's lots of things being put together, savings if there are any, to actually facilitate that move. And so you facilitate that move and you arrive in London, and then London goes into lockdown, or you arrive in London and Glasgow, I should say, and they go into lockdown. So moving on to the second part of the empirical bit, which is really to think about the context or the situation where debt gets refueled because of the pandemic, or debts become sort of, if you like, supercharged during the pandemic. As you might expect, and across these three communities, we came across multidimensional vulnerabilities that related to work and employment, to housing, and particularly to rent arrears, in relation to health, in relation to education, and also in relation to food insecurity. That is quite a significant finding, the extent to which, and particularly amongst undocumented migrants and international migrants, the extent to which there was food insecurity, people telling us that they didn't have anything to eat for 4 days. And I guess leading to that situation of basically people taking on more debt. So in the interest of time, I'll just focus on work and employment and housing and rent arrears here. So in terms of the economic impacts of COVID-19, it's important to recognize that even within the Indian community, we had a diversity of experiences. So you have some where there's relatively little economic impact. These are essential workers. They continue to work during the pandemic. Some people are able to work from home. They're in stable employment. Those who have regular immigration status are able to access furlough payments. But this is not the whole story. So for others, nearly half of the survey participants, we saw individual work earnings decreasing, as did household income as well. And generally, this is borne out by wider data. Migrant unemployment rose steeply and much more steeply for migrant populations as opposed to UK-born populations. Partly, we think, because of an overrepresentation of migrants in hard-hit sectors and among workers with non-permanent contracts. Many migrants, and especially, of course, undocumented migrants, but also international students, were not eligible for the government support that was available. They were not eligible, for example, to furlough income. They had precarious and informal work arrangements. Because of their immigration status, this was compounded, but also because they had no recourse to public funds. And this translates into a struggle with essential expenses in relation to food, in relation to housing, and in relation to education. So the overall picture really to get, or the argument to put across, is that you can see that it is increasingly difficult to get by without recourse to a range of borrowing, but increasingly also sharing practices. And I'll come to that in a minute. And it's not only undocumented migrants who are hit by this, but also international students. So international students who were suddenly confronted with tuition fees, for example, and so that you need to pay your tuition fee irrespective of whatever is happening at universities, that needs to be repaid. Where initial fees might be paid through borrowing, as well as in the case of this international student whose parents had taken on a loan, and then the remainder of the fees have to be paid. And the plan was that you would work and pay and save and pay your fee and save and pay for your living expenses, but those jobs have not materialized because of the pandemic. There's no jobs to be had. And so therefore you have this real sense of sort of impending crisis that if you're unable to pay your fee, then you should leave the United Kingdom. Moving on to housing and rent arrears, I guess just a general point in terms of housing deprivation, which is not unusual for anybody working on migrant communities, is that, of course, we are very well aware of very overcrowded housing situations that people put up with. The worst case for us was one woman who said that they were sharing the house with 26 other people. It was very common for people to tell us they were sharing accommodation with 13, 14, 15. And in fact, in some cases, they didn't actually know the precise number of people they were sharing accommodation with. There's particular concerns over COVID-19, of course, and this is not specific just to migrants, of sharing housing with strangers in particular, of sharing really crowded facilities like kitchens, like bathrooms, like toilets with people who are not observing social distancing, who are still going out, et cetera, and who are carrying the virus in and out of the accommodation. Again, international students are quite impacted because of the fact that universities shut down and basically told these students to shift out, that, you need to find private accommodation. Where were they going to find the deposits from? Where were they going to find the money for rent, etc.? That was being demanded now. But also that many of the migrants, despite sort of public pronouncements that there should be moratoriums on rent and that rents shouldn't increase during this period, that demands continue to be made on some of them, not all of them. So some of them did tell us about landlords who were very accommodating, who didn't ask for rent for 2 or 3 or 4 months during the pandemic or during the worst part of the pandemic, to others who lived, and particularly those who lived with landlords, often said that it was difficult to escape the landlord, to escape demands to pay rent. And so in the instance of this particular undocumented migrant, it was about trying to find help, which she got from her church, and to raise some money so that they could actually move out and pay the deposit for another place. And in this particular instance, actually, I should say that it is the demand for rent is not insignificant, because they were paying £750 for a room that she was sharing with her husband and 2 children. And so that rent was being paid through the work that all 4 of them were doing. But when that work stopped again, it becomes difficult to pay the rent. And so you start to accumulate rent arrears and a great deal of anxiety around that. So the last cut, really thinking about local and transnational caring during the crisis. And I thought it would be interesting to just highlight that there's different experiences, and looking at the local first, that amongst some, there was this kind of sense that that nobody cared for you in London and nobody cared for you in Glasgow, that you were on your own. And so this undocumented migrant who told us to this point that she's apprehensive, that people are apprehensive of her approaching them because she might ask them for a favor. And so she tends not to ask. And the sense of being alone, the sense of being fearful because you're alone, and especially if there's another lockdown, who do you actually turn to? And how different that is from back home where you have friends, and that kind of sense that support and sharing and all of that, and emotional support in particular, is not just about financial support. It's not just about money, but it's actually about getting about these other kinds of support, like her friends had offered her family while she was in India. Within that context, though, we also, what came across all of the communities, including the Indian community, was the extent to which community and migrant organizations were first responders during the crisis. That it was not the local government, it was not, certainly it wasn't central government that stepped in for them, but it was these organizations that they had, that had some sense of what these communities were about and what their needs were. Amongst undocumented migrants in particular, but also international students, there was a lack of awareness of pandemic-related initiatives, of services, and of their rights to access these, particularly in relation to food banks, for example. Many migrants told us that I didn't know I was eligible to go to a food bank, and that was quite insightful. Within this context, and the diaspora and diaspora communities, faith organizations, food banks become hugely significant. And here's where I'm talking about sort of a sharing economy and thinking about the connection between, I guess, debt as a financial practice, but also about sharing economies, which are about more than debt or different from debt. So it's thinking about those relationships as well. And this sharing is sharing of information. And this information is shared on WhatsApp, and huge WhatsApp groups are created by diaspora communities in Glasgow, for example, with international students so that they can identify their needs, a lot of which is around food. Food parcels are brought together and delivered to halls of residence and to private residences to support these students. So it's about the sharing of information, but it is also fundamentally, and it goes back to sort of debt, and at least or going back to a need for loans, a need for money. And a lot of that is raised informally by borrowing between friends, and not just in London, but also borrowing from friends who are situated elsewhere in the diaspora. So in a couple of instances, friends who had migrated to Canada and Australia were better off, were sending money, which would tide you over during the pandemic. Going back to remittances, and I'll end in just a couple of slides, is thinking about transnational caring needs. And what a lot of migrants told us, including this one, was the extent to which their family relied upon the remittances. So in this particular instance, the quote that's at the top of the slide, that my family needs a lot of help in India. And this was a migrant woman whose mother had recently died. Her brother, who was an undocumented migrant in Australia, had been deported back to India. Her brother-in-law had just lost his job. So this whole sense of not just parents, but a whole family in crisis, which is then dependent upon her remittances, and remittances that she's finding increasingly difficult to send. What our research found, and which again was found at a global scale, was despite that, that sort of forecast of 20% decline, remittances actually declined far less percentage-wise. So it's estimated in 2020 they declined actually by 7% and not by 20%. So the decline was far less than predicted. And what we found was that the proportion of respondents who were remitting to families in 2020 compared to 2019 remained roughly the same. The average amount slightly higher. The average amount remitted by year did decrease, but the total amount stayed the same. And to try and understand that, I mean, why is that actually happening? If I move on to the next slide, it's got something to do undoubtedly with the stress and the need to continue to remit, right? So this woman who told us that how they felt very sad, very helpless. It's our parents who say on the one side, you don't need to send, but at the back of my mind, I know that they need the money. And she doesn't know how she survived herself with all of those thoughts in her mind. And so the pressure to support family and friends abroad is sort of is reported in roughly equal proportions, that some migrants say that they're not pressured and others migrants say that they are. And in the instance of the final quote that I have here is this migrant who talked about the fact, who had migrated here himself, he'd left his wife and his family behind, who often talked about his wife as having sort of being very stressed and very anxious, having mental health issues, and the extent to which it was easier for him to borrow money so as to remit. So that's the other thing, that we often think about remittances as paying debt, but not as debt taken in order to remit So it's easier for him to borrow money in order to continue to remit rather than explain the situation that he's in to his family, rather than acknowledge all of the hardships that he has to bear as an undocumented migrant living in the UK. So by way of conclusion, really just to say that debt, I hope, as I've illustrated, is a feature of many migration stories. It precedes migration and it is remade through mobility and migration as well. It takes on different forms. The pandemic has had multiple impacts upon migrant communities. That is undeniable. And for some, these deprivations have been exacerbated by debt, by new debts that they've had to take, by old debts which cannot be paid now because, or which could not be paid for a period of the lockdown in particular, when people lost their jobs or were unable to work to the extent that they might have liked to. So that exacerbated kind of these deprivations. And that I think that the area where there is sort of research for, or where there is food for, or space for research is really in exploring this relationship between debt and remittances, but also debt, remittances, and sharing economies, and the various manifestations of these. I'll stop there. I hope I haven't got too much overtime. And I'll stop sharing.
Not at all. Thank you, Kavita. That was absolutely fascinating. Fascinating and alarming, I should say, I think in equal measure. And incredibly comprehensive. You covered so much there in a relatively short space of time. So thank you for that. I am going to open it up to the floor for any questions, comments, thoughts on that really interesting presentation.